Veteran's son stands up to woman mocking his father's service. Tommy Williams, a young man in his early 20s, was the embodiment of quiet introspection. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, nor did he seek attention or revel in the spotlight. He was content with his life, albeit in a comfortable, understated way. A good job at a local hardware store, a small but close-knit group of friends, and the occasional weekend out with his father. These were the things that made up his world. Tommy liked predictability. He liked routine. For Tommy, life was best when things were simple, when there were no surprises, no disruptions to the status quo. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. He'd grown up with a strong sense of family, of respect for the traditions passed down through generations. His father, Sergeant Ben Williams, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, but Tommy didn't often talk about his father's military service. It wasn't that he was ashamed, far from it. Tommy just never felt the need to constantly bring it up. His father, in his quiet dignity, didn't flaunt his past, nor did he seek recognition for his sacrifices. He wore his military cap proudly, but it was a subtle sign of his service. To Tommy, his father was just Dad, his steadfast, reliable father who had always been there for him. The weight of his father's history, his legacy of sacrifice, wasn't something Tommy had thought deeply about. Life, to Tommy, had always been about what was in front of him, today, tomorrow, and the next day. Tommy's life, for all its comfort, had become a series of quiet moments. He would wake up in the mornings, get ready for work, and spend his days at the hardware store, assisting customers and organizing inventory. It was a peaceful job, steady, predictable, and comfortable. In the evenings, he would return home to his small apartment, grab a quick bite, and spend time with his father. The two of them didn't need to say much. They were used to the silence between them, silence that, in its own way, spoke volumes. Tommy had always admired his father's quiet strength, his ability to be present without needing to fill the space with words. There was comfort in that silence, in the understanding they shared without needing to articulate it. Yet, in the back of Tommy's mind, there was always the nagging feeling that there was more to life than the daily grind of work and routine. There was the lingering thought that perhaps his life lacked something deeper, something more meaningful. But Tommy had never really known how to articulate that desire. What did it mean to have a purpose? Wasn't his current life enough? After all, he had a job, he had his father, he had his friends. So, why did he still feel like something was missing? It wasn't that Tommy wasn't grateful for what he had. He appreciated the stability, the security of knowing what to expect every day. His father, ever the pragmatist, had taught him the value of hard work, of living with purpose, even if that purpose wasn't always glamorous. "It's the little things that matter, Tommy," his father would say, his voice steady and measured. "The everyday moments, those are the ones you'll remember." Tommy had taken those words to heart, even if he never fully understood them. His father had never been one for grand speeches or philosophical musings. He didn't need to be. He lived his life through his actions, through his unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when no one was watching. And Tommy had always admired that, admired it without fully comprehending it. But as time went on, the weight of his father's silence began to make Tommy wonder if there was something he was missing. His father had seen the horrors of war, had sacrificed more than Tommy could ever understand. Yet his father never spoke of it, never spoke of his time in Afghanistan, the friends he had lost, or the scars he carried, both physical and emotional. For Tommy, this silence was a puzzle, a gap in his understanding of his father. Tommy didn't know how to approach the subject, and his father never broached it either. It was as if both of them had agreed, tacitly, that the past was something to be left untouched. The thought that his father's silence might be a form of coping, a defense mechanism against the pain of his past, never occurred to Tommy. He simply accepted it, unaware that it was perhaps a barrier, a wall that neither of them knew how to break down. The truth was, Tommy had never been forced to confront the deeper meanings behind his father's service, what it had cost him, what it meant to him, and what it had cost their family. It wasn't a conversation that had ever come up. It wasn't something that Tommy had ever felt compelled to bring up. To him, his father was a quiet, steady figure, someone who had done what he needed to do, who had made sacrifices but never talked about them. And that was just the way it was. It wasn't something Tommy questioned. It wasn't something he thought needed to be questioned. Until that afternoon in Liberty Café, Tommy had never realized that he had been living in a comfortable bubble of unawareness. He wasn't a coward, but in many ways, Tommy had been passive in his life. He had been passive in his relationship with his father's past, passive in the way he accepted the roles that life had handed him. He had been content to go through the motions, to let life happen to him without truly challenging it. He was comfortable in his small world, in his predictable routine. But that comfort was also a prison of his own making. And like all prisons, it began to close in on him until there was no room left to grow. Tommy was used to walking through life with blinders on. He would go about his day, working in the hardware store, chatting with friends, occasionally meeting up with his father for a quiet dinner. He had never felt the need to look beyond the surface of things until the day in Liberty Café when everything changed. That afternoon, when the woman, Karen Taylor, mocked his father's military cap, everything Tommy had known about his own life and his father's past was suddenly called into question. It was as though the comfortable bubble he had built around himself had been punctured, and he was forced to see the world and his father's place in it through a different lens. At first, Tommy hadn't known how to react. He had been stunned, unsure of how to process the woman's comment. It felt like a betrayal of sorts, an attack on something Tommy held dear. But as the seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence, something inside him began to shift. He realized that he couldn't let the moment pass. He couldn't let this woman's words slide by unnoticed, as he might have in the past. This time, for whatever reason, he felt compelled to act. He felt an overwhelming need to defend his father, to stand up for something bigger than himself. The words that came out of his mouth, strong, firm, and unwavering, surprised even him. As he spoke, Tommy felt a surge of something he hadn't known was there. Courage. It wasn't loud or brash, but it was real. And in that moment, Tommy realized that his life, up until that point, had been defined by an unwillingness to engage with the deeper, more difficult aspects of his existence. He had been hiding behind the comfort of his daily routine, avoiding confrontation and difficult conversations, even with his own father. He had never truly questioned the cost of the sacrifices his father had made, nor had he ever truly stood up for what was right. But that afternoon in the cafe, Tommy had done something he'd never done before. He had broken free from his zone of comfort, his predictable existence, and he had chosen to stand up for his father in a way he never had before. And in doing so, Tommy began to realize that life wasn't just about going through the motions. It was about moments like this, moments that forced you to confront uncomfortable truths, to face challenges head-on, and to stand firm in your convictions, even when it felt hard. That was the moment that changed everything. Tommy had always lived a life of quiet complacency, but in standing up for his father, he had stepped into a new chapter, one that would challenge him to grow in ways he had never imagined. And as the seconds passed in the cafe, Tommy knew that his life would never be the same again. The comfortable bubble he had built around himself had been shattered, and in its place was something far more complex, an awareness of his father's sacrifices, and a realization that he, too, would have to find his voice in the world. For most of his life, Tommy Williams had never felt the need to push beyond the boundaries of his small, comfortable world. He didn't need grand aspirations or sweeping dreams to define himself. His world was quiet and dependable. He worked at a local hardware store, a place where the same customers came in every week to buy their tools and supplies, exchanging pleasantries and small talk with Tommy. It was predictable, and Tommy found comfort in that. It was a life of routine, a life that required little in terms of deep introspection. He had his father, his friends, and his job, and in his mind, that was enough. There was no need for anything else. But in the depths of his mind, there was a small, quiet voice that began to grow louder as time passed. Tommy wasn't quite sure what that voice was asking for, but he could feel it urging him towards something more, something deeper. That voice had started as a whisper, easy to ignore. But as the years passed, it became harder to silence. At first, it manifested in moments of dissatisfaction, brief flashes when Tommy would look out the window of his small apartment and wonder if there was more to life than this. He'd see young people out in the streets of Houston, walking confidently toward their futures with a sense of purpose, and for a brief moment, he would question his own path. Was this all there was for him? The same daily grind, the same conversations with familiar faces, the same routines that he could do in his sleep? In those moments, Tommy would shake the feeling away, convincing himself that his life was fine. He had a good job, a stable home, and a father who had always been there for him. What more could he want? But it wasn't that simple. The voice in his head grew louder, demanding attention. Tommy began to realize that something was missing, though he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. He wasn't unhappy with his life. He didn't resent his job or his relationships, but there was a nagging sense that he was just going through the motions. Each day felt like a repetition of the last, a never-ending loop of tasks and conversations that lacked deeper meaning. It wasn't that Tommy didn't appreciate what he had. It was just that he sensed a hollowness beneath the surface. He wasn't truly living his life. He was simply existing in it. And that realization, uncomfortable as it was, started to push him toward a change he hadn't anticipated. Tommy began to think more about his father. Sergeant Ben Williams had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, a service that had marked him deeply. Yet his father never talked about it. There was no mention of the horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost, or the scars, both visible and invisible, that he carried with him. Tommy had grown up with his father's stoic silence, the unspoken rule that certain things were better left unsaid. But as Tommy got older, he began to wonder, what did his father really feel about the sacrifices he had made for his country? How did the war shape him, and what did it mean for their family? It wasn't just about military service. It was about the deeper emotional cost of those years. Tommy began to recognize that he hadn't fully understood what it meant to be the child of a soldier, especially one who had served in a conflict as brutal as Afghanistan. His father's service was something that Tommy had always accepted without truly understanding it. He had always seen his father as a strong, reliable man, someone who worked hard, provided for the family, and lived a simple life. But over time, Tommy realized that his father's strength was built on a foundation of sacrifice and experience that went far beyond anything Tommy had ever known. The more Tommy thought about it, the more he began to feel a sense of guilt. He hadn't fully appreciated his father's sacrifices. He had never truly asked his father what it was like to serve in a foreign war, to come home and try to reintegrate into civilian life, to live with the memories of what he had experienced. Tommy hadn't wanted to confront these difficult topics. It was easier to stay in the comfortable bubble of silence that had always existed between them. But the more he considered it, the more he realized that he wanted to know. He wanted to understand what his father had gone through, not just for his own peace of mind, but to show his father the respect he had always deserved. And yet, even as Tommy grappled with these thoughts, he didn't know how to approach them. He wasn't sure how to ask his father about the past without sounding intrusive or disrespectful. After all, his father had never talked about it. It was a subject that, for reasons unknown, had remained off-limits. Tommy didn't want to push too hard, didn't want to force his father into a conversation that might reopen old wounds. But the desire to know, to truly understand, was growing inside him, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed to know what his father had been through. He needed to know how it had shaped him, how it had shaped their relationship, and how it had affected his father's approach to life. This desire to understand his father was, in many ways, the root of Tommy's longing for something more in his life. It wasn't just about wanting to know the details of his father's military service. It was about wanting to connect with him on a deeper level, to break through the wall of silence and unspoken words that had always existed between them. Tommy realized that, for all the love and respect he had for his father, there was a part of him that had always remained distant. There was a part of him that had never truly understood what it meant to be the child of a man who had given so much for his country. And that understanding, Tommy realized, was what he wanted more than anything. It wasn't enough to simply exist alongside his father. He wanted to know him, truly know him. Tommy's desire for a deeper connection with his father coincided with his growing dissatisfaction with his own life. He had always been passive, allowing life to happen to him, never fully questioning the roles he had been assigned. He had always followed the path laid out for him, going to school, getting a job, living a quiet life. But now, as he looked back on his father's service and sacrifice, Tommy began to feel a sense of responsibility. He couldn't keep living in the comfortable bubble he had created for himself. He had to confront his own life, his own choices, and his own reluctance to step outside his comfort zone. It wasn't just his father's history that Tommy had to confront, it was his own. Tommy realized that, in avoiding difficult conversations with his father, he had also avoided facing the difficult truths about his own life. He had been coasting along, not truly living, not truly engaging with the world around him. He had built a life that was safe, predictable, and comfortable, but that life had begun to feel empty. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he wanted something more. He wanted to make a difference, to find a purpose that went beyond just surviving each day. He didn't know what that purpose was yet, but he knew he couldn't keep waiting for it to come to him. Tommy's growing desire for something more, a deeper understanding of his father, a deeper understanding of his own life, was what finally pushed him to confront the world beyond his comfort zone. He didn't realize it at the time, but that shift in perspective, that desire to understand, would set the stage for the moment that changed everything. The moment in Liberty Café, when he would be forced to stand up for his father and for what he believed was right. It was this combination of desire for understanding and the growing dissatisfaction with his own life that would propel Tommy out of his zone of comfort. He didn't yet know it, but the quiet yearning for something deeper would lead him to a confrontation with a woman who mocked his father's service, and in doing so, it would lead him to discover his own voice, his own courage, and ultimately, a deeper connection with his father. But before that moment, Tommy was still unsure of what he truly wanted. He knew that something was missing, but he didn't know how to articulate it. What he wanted was clarity, connection, and purpose. He wanted to stop coasting through life and start truly living it. The day began like any other for Tommy Williams. He woke up to the hum of his alarm clock, showered, dressed, and made a quick breakfast, a cup of coffee and a slice of toast. His father, Sergeant Ben Williams, was already awake, seated at the kitchen table, his military cap resting on the chair next to him. Tommy didn't think much of it. His father wore that cap every day, as though it had become a part of him, an accessory like any other. It had never seemed unusual, not to Tommy anyway. It was just Dad's way. But today, something felt different, even before they left the house. It wasn't the kind of difference you could articulate or put into words. It was just a subtle shift in the air, a sense that something was waiting to happen, though Tommy couldn't have known what. He didn't think much of it as he grabbed his coat and slid into the passenger seat of his father's old truck. The ride to Liberty Café was filled with easy conversation, mostly about nothing important. His father had always been the quiet type, and Tommy had learned to fill the silence with small talk, discussing the weather or the latest news. It wasn't that they didn't have deep conversations, it's just that they didn't need to have them every day. Their bond was built on quiet understanding, on the shared space between them. They didn't need to speak in order to know what the other was thinking. When they arrived at Liberty Café, a small but popular diner known for its cozy atmosphere and hearty breakfasts, Tommy was still caught up in his thoughts. He hadn't even noticed how busy the place was until they walked through the door. The usual morning crowd had gathered, each table filled with people sipping coffee, reading newspapers, and chatting. Tommy and his father took their usual spot by the window, a booth that overlooked the bustling street outside. It was a place that felt familiar and safe to Tommy. He liked it here. The scent of fresh pancakes and bacon in the air, the clink of plates and silverware, the hum of quiet conversation. Everything about this place felt like home. They were just about to place their order when Tommy noticed her, the woman sitting across the room, hunched over her coffee, her attention fixed on something in the distance. She was one of those people who seemed to demand attention without trying. Her expression was pinched, as if she was constantly judging the world around her. Tommy didn't think much of it at first. After all, Liberty Café was a casual place, and everyone came in with their own little quirks and personalities. He and his father had their routine, and they weren't there to judge anyone else. But when Tommy turned his attention back to his father, something caught his eye. The woman was staring at them now. More specifically, she was staring at Hi's father's military cap. Tommy felt a strange unease wash over him, though he couldn't quite place why. It wasn't like the woman had done anything overtly rude yet, but there was something in the way she was eyeing them that made Tommy uncomfortable. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the menu in front of him, but the feeling lingered. His father, ever the stoic figure, didn't notice. He was fiddling with a salt shaker on the table, lost in his own thoughts. To Tommy, his father seemed like a man who was always somewhere else, as if his mind wandered to places far beyond the small world they occupied. Tommy knew it wasn't intentional. It was just how his father was. He had spent so much of his life serving in the military, fighting wars, and living through experiences that Tommy could never understand, that sometimes it felt like he was still fighting them in his mind. Tommy was just about to say something to his father when the woman's voice cut through the air, sharp and condescending. "Isn't that a bit much?" she said, her words carrying across the room with surprising clarity. Tommy's heart skipped a beat. He glanced up and saw her staring directly at his father's military cap, a smirk playing on her lips. "You'd think someone his age would be overplaying dress-up." The words landed like a slap in the face. Tommy's blood ran cold. The woman's voice was full of contempt, as if his father's service, his sacrifice, was something to be mocked. Tommy didn't fully register what was happening at first. It was as if the words had been spoken in another language, one that didn't belong in the world he knew. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened in Liberty Café. This wasn't the kind of world Tommy had grown up in. For a moment, Tommy just stared at the woman, disbelief written across his face. His father, however, didn't react. He didn't even seem to notice the woman's words, or at least he didn't let it show. Tommy could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm just waiting to break. His father kept stirring his coffee, completely unaware of the insult that had been thrown his way. Tommy could see the veins in his father's hands as he stirred the cup slowly, as though time itself had slowed down, giving Tommy a chance to fully process the words he had just heard. That was when it hit him. It wasn't just an insult to his father. It was an attack on everything his father had done, everything he had sacrificed. It was an attack on the very core of his being, the quiet dignity that had defined his father's life. Tommy felt a surge of anger rise within him, the kind of anger he had never experienced before. The kind of anger that demanded to be acted upon, even if he didn't know how. Before he could stop himself, Tommy was on his feet. His legs moved without thinking, carrying him toward the woman who had spoken so callously about his father. As he walked, his heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced. What was he doing? He wasn't the type to get into confrontations. He was the type who let things go, who stayed out of drama, and kept his head down. But something had changed in him. Something had shifted. The woman saw him approaching, and her eyes narrowed. She didn't seem to register the seriousness of the situation. Not yet. To her, this was just another random interaction in a day full of them. She wasn't prepared for what was coming. Tommy reached the table, and for the first time in his life, he found himself standing up for something that mattered, something real. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm but calm. "What did you just say?" The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his sudden appearance. She looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his gaze. For a moment, she seemed to struggle to find words, but Tommy didn't give her the chance to backpedal. His father remained oblivious, still stirring his coffee, unaware of the confrontation brewing beside him. Tommy's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "That cap means something. My father served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He earned that hat, just like he earned every ounce of respect. And you don't get to mock that." The woman's face reddened, and for a brief moment, Tommy thought she might try to fire back with more insults. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at him, at his father, and then back at Tommy. Her posture faltered. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if she had been caught in the act, and the realization of her own words was beginning to sink in. The silence in the cafe grew heavier, and Tommy stood his ground. He didn't care if she was embarrassed, if people in the cafe were starting to take notice. What mattered was his father's dignity, his service, and the honor that had been stripped away by the woman's careless words. He wasn't going to back down.
Not now.
Not ever. What do you have to say for yourself? Tommy pressed, his voice stronger now. My father isn't a joke. You should be ashamed of yourself for disrespecting someone who gave so much. The woman opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. For the first time, she seemed to realize that her words had consequences, that her insults had hurt someone far beyond what she could see. Tommy felt a strange sense of power in that moment. The unfamiliar situation he found himself in wasn't just about defending his father. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself. Something that demanded respect. As he stood there, facing the woman who had mocked his father's service, Tommy understood that this was the moment that would change everything. In confronting the woman, Tommy had crossed a line. He had stepped out of the small, predictable world he had lived in for so long. There was no turning back. And as the woman fell silent, her face flushed with shame, Tommy knew that the world was never going to look the same again. The silence in Liberty Cafe was suffocating. For what felt like an eternity, Tommy stood at the table, eyes locked on the woman who had insulted his father. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. His heart hammered in his chest, and his palms began to sweat, though his posture remained steady. He wasn't sure if it was anger or adrenaline, but whatever it was keeping him grounded in a way he had never experienced before. He didn't know what had come over him, but in this moment, something deep inside him had clicked. He couldn't back down now. Not after everything his father had given, not after the disrespect he had witnessed. The woman, whose arrogance had first driven her to speak without thinking, now seemed completely unmoored. She shifted in her seat, her gaze darting from Tommy to his father, who still sat, blissfully unaware of the storm that had erupted in the cafe. The woman opened her mouth a few times as if she were trying to form a coherent response, but the words seemed to fail her. The patrons around them, once absorbed in their own conversations, had quieted down. Tommy could feel their eyes on him, the heat of their stares adding to the pressure. They were watching now, waiting to see what would happen next. Tommy didn't know what was going to happen, but he was determined to face it. Is there something you want to say? Tommy's voice broke the silence again, harder now, as his frustration mounted. He didn't care anymore if the woman apologized, if she backpedaled or made excuses. The damage had been done, and Tommy wasn't going to let it slide. The woman's face turned crimson, her earlier smugness replaced by a quiet, rattled confusion. Her eyes flicked from Tommy to his father, still oblivious to the confrontation, then back at Tommy again. She seemed to gather herself, opening her mouth once more. But then, the strangest thing happened. Instead of an insult, or a defense of her actions, the woman let out a long, shaky sigh and sank back into her seat. Look, she started, her voice quieter now. Tommy was taken aback. This wasn't the response he had expected. He had been bracing for another cutting remark, another round of verbal sparring, but instead, the woman's shoulders slumped as if all the tension had suddenly drained from her body. Tommy wasn't sure what to make of it. He had never been in a situation like this before, and the unfamiliarity of it was disorienting. For a long moment, the woman said nothing. Tommy stood there, watching her closely, waiting for her to either apologize or dig in her heels further. But instead, she just stared at the table, her hands clenched tightly around her coffee cup, her knuckles turning white. The room felt frozen, every person present waiting for some kind of resolution, some kind of acknowledgement of what had just happened. Tommy shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to proceed. He had stood up to her. He had called her out for her words, for her disrespect. He had demanded an apology, demanded that she recognize the wrongness of what she had said. But now, faced with the woman's quiet, almost defeated response, Tommy didn't know how to push forward. He had expected her to be defensive, to lash out or make excuses, but instead, She seemed to retreat into herself. In a way, it was almost more unsettling than if she had continued to argue. Why would you say something like that? Tommy asked, his voice softer now, a little less sure. He hadn't meant to show any weakness, but something about the woman's reaction made him pause. The anger that had surged through him just moments before seemed to ebb, replaced by a faint sense of pity. For the first time, Tommy realized that perhaps this woman wasn't just a simple villain in this moment. Maybe she wasn't a caricature of rudeness, but a person with her own story, her own reasons for acting the way she did. The woman looked up at him, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I don't know, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I'm sorry if I offended you. There was no bravado in her tone now, no self-assurance. Instead, there was only a raw, unspoken admission that the words had come from somewhere deeper, somewhere more complicated. Tommy took a step back, unsure of what to do with her apology, or with the realization that maybe she hadn't just been being malicious, but rather reacting to something he didn't understand. His father had always taught him that not everything was black and white, and though Tommy had been quick to defend his dad, he realized that maybe the situation wasn't as straightforward as he had initially thought. It wasn't just about defending his father's honor anymore. It was about something deeper, something human. But the moment didn't last long. Tommy glanced over at his father, who was still casually sipping his coffee, oblivious to the tension around him. Something inside Tommy shifted again, this time toward resolve. His father didn't need to be involved in this. Tommy had done what he had set out to do. He had stood up for his father, he had defended his father's service, and he had demanded respect. Now it was time to bring it to a close. It was time to end the confrontation, before it spiraled into something else entirely. Tommy took a deep breath, exhaled, and looked back at the woman, who was now staring at her coffee cup with a mixture of shame and confusion. He could tell that she was processing something, whether it was the weight of her own words or the realization that her actions had consequences. Tommy didn't know. But whatever it was, it had stopped her in her tracks. For that, he could respect her. "All right," he said after a moment, his voice steady but less forceful than before. "I think we're good here." He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement that they could both move on. "But next time, think before you speak. People have been through a lot to get where they are." With that, Tommy turned on his heel and made his way back to his seat across from his father. He was still digesting the events that had just unfolded, but he couldn't linger on it for too long. The confrontation was over, at least for now, and he had done what he needed to do. As he slid back into the booth and settled into the cushion, he glanced at his father again. Ben Williams was still oblivious to what had just transpired, his attention fixed entirely on the cup of coffee in front of him. Tommy sat there for a moment, taking it all in. He had stood up for his father, but more than that, he had learned something about himself in the process. He had stepped outside of his comfort zone, outside of the quiet life he had built for himself, and into an unfamiliar situation that demanded something from him. The anger he had initially felt had been replaced with a kind of quiet reflection. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling. He wasn't sure if it was relief or exhaustion, but he knew that he had done the right thing. He had defended his father's honor, yes, but he had also defended his own dignity, his own voice. And for the first time in a long time, Tommy felt like he wasn't just living in the shadow of his father's life. He was beginning to carve out his own. As Tommy sat there, watching the woman across the room slowly retreat into herself, he realized that the encounter had changed him. He had entered the situation as a bystander, as someone who was simply trying to get through another day. But now, he felt like someone who had taken control of his own story. He wasn't just the son of a soldier anymore. He was a man who could stand up for what he believed in, who could defend the people he loved and the things that mattered. And in that moment, Tommy Williams realized that he had just taken the first step toward becoming someone he could respect. It wasn't about the confrontation, the apology, or even the woman. It was about the quiet strength that had been awakened in him. It was about the ability to adapt, to step into an uncomfortable, unfamiliar situation and face it head-on. And though Tommy didn't yet know where this new strength would take him, he knew that he was no longer the passive bystander he had been.
He was part of the story now.
And that made all the difference. Tommy sat back down across from his father, his breath still coming in shallow bursts as the reality of the situation settled in. He had done it. He had stood up to that woman, called her out for her disrespect, and in the process, had defended everything his father had worked for, everything his father had sacrificed. Tommy had expected the tension to lift once it was over, expected a sense of relief to wash over him, but instead, something unexpected crept into his chest, a strange sense of unease. His father, Sergeant Ben Williams, remained blissfully unaware of the exchange that had just unfolded. The older man continued to sip his coffee, eyes distant, as if nothing had happened. To Ben, the world had remained unchanged. He had no idea that Tommy had just defended his honor in front of an entire cafe. The thought should have made Tommy feel proud, but instead, it left him feeling hollow, as if he had gained something he didn't fully understand. Across the room, the woman had finally stopped staring into her coffee cup. She had shifted in her seat, sitting straighter now, her hands still gripping her mug. She hadn't left, which Tommy took as a sign of some measure of remorse or recognition. Maybe she hadn't been prepared for what had just happened. Maybe the reality of her actions had started to sink in. But either way, the confrontation had ended, and Tommy could feel the shift within him. He had won, at least, that's what it felt like. He had made her see the mistake she'd made, forced her to acknowledge the hurt she had caused. And yet, despite this, something inside him gnawed at him, something that he couldn't shake. Tommy turned his gaze to his father once more. The older man was still lost in his thoughts, his rough hands wrapped around his cup, his eyes fixed on some distant point outside the cafe window. It occurred to Tommy that his father, in all his years of service, had never sought recognition. Ben had never asked for gratitude, never even discussed his tours in Afghanistan unless it was absolutely necessary. It had always been Tommy who sought to prove something to the world, something about his father, his legacy. Ben never cared about validation, about others knowing what he had done. He had done it because it was his duty, because he believed in it, and that was enough. But Tommy hadn't quite understood that until now. Now that he had taken action, now that he had forced the woman to acknowledge his father's sacrifice, he realized that the victory he thought he'd achieved felt somewhat shallow. What had he truly gained in this moment? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the woman's voice, tentative but clear across the cafe. "Hey," she said, as if unsure of whether to approach them. Tommy's gaze snapped up, and he saw that she was standing now, her shoulders slumped, her hands still gripping the mug. She was looking directly at Tommy, her eyes avoiding his father. Tommy's stomach tightened. He didn't know if he was ready for another round, if he even wanted to hear her apology. What more could she say? She had already acknowledged her mistake in her quiet way. What more could she offer? But to Tommy's surprise, the woman wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't trying to defend herself or explain away her actions. Instead, she took a deep breath and, in a voice almost too soft to hear, said, "I just wanted to say,
I'm sorry for what I said.
I didn't mean to hurt anyone, especially not someone like him." She motioned toward Ben, still unaware of the tension in the room. Tommy didn't immediately respond. His heart was pounding now, but it wasn't out of anger anymore. It wasn't the triumph he had expected either. No, this was something entirely different, something more complicated. He had stood up for his father, yes, but the price of that victory was becoming clearer. What had he really achieved? I don't know why I said it," the woman continued, her voice shaking slightly now, her earlier bravado completely gone. She trailed off, eyes flicking to Tommy, then quickly back to the floor. "I don't know. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." Tommy opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. On some level, he felt vindicated. On another, he felt conflicted. The apology felt so insincere, yet so genuine at the same time. The woman seemed to be struggling with something within herself, a realization of just how wrong she had been. But Tommy didn't know how to process it. He didn't know if it was enough to make things right, if it was enough to clear the air. For a moment, Tommy just stared at her, processing the apology. It wasn't the immediate satisfaction of a loud, defensive exchange that he had envisioned in the heat of the moment. It was quiet, subdued, almost uncomfortable. And yet, it was more meaningful than any verbal clash could have been. This wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about proving his father's worth to a stranger. It was about something deeper. Tommy had wanted her to see his father, to see the man beneath the military cap, the sacrifices he had made. But now, the apology seemed hollow against the backdrop of everything Tommy had learned in that fleeting moment. "Thank you," Tommy said, his voice tight. The words felt forced, like they didn't quite fit. But they were the only words he could offer. What else was there to say? The woman nodded, her eyes downcast as if she had finally accepted the weight of her mistake. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't press further. She simply nodded and turned to leave the cafe, her head low. Tommy watched her walk away, a sense of relief mixed with anything else, a lingering discomfort that he couldn't quite place. "Dad," Tommy finally said, his voice quieter now. His father blinked, clearly startled, as though emerging from a long, deep thought. "That woman.
She was rude to you."
She said something bad about your cap." Ben Williams looked up slowly, blinking again as if trying to process what Tommy had just said. Tommy had never seen his father so unaware of what was happening around him. The world had always felt like a quieter place to his father, a place where he had fought his battles far from prying eyes. Ben hadn't sought accolades. His life was lived in small, everyday moments, like sitting in Liberty Café, sipping his coffee, enjoying the silence. He had never wanted the world to make a fuss over his service. "Did she?" Ben asked softly, lifting his mug to his lips again. The simple question made Tommy's chest tighten. His father had been through so much. 2 tours in Afghanistan, countless nights alone, endless battles, both literal and emotional, and yet he was oblivious to this small moment. His father's indifference to the insult, his inability to care about the woman's words, only added to Tommy's sense of confusion. Tommy let out a breath, letting the answer hang in the air. There was no need to elaborate further. His father didn't need to know the details. He didn't need to know that Tommy had stood up to someone on his behalf. That was the point. His father had never sought validation, and now that Tommy had gotten the apology he thought he wanted, it felt strangely hollow. But in that quiet moment, with his father sipping his coffee and staring out the window, Tommy realized something important. The woman's apology wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the lesson he had learned. What mattered was that Tommy had finally stepped out of the shadow of his father's service and stood up for him, not for anyone else's recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Tommy had stepped into his father's world, just for a moment, and had seen it from a different perspective. It wasn't about getting the apology, or about confronting the woman. It was about understanding that respect didn't need to be earned through grand gestures or speeches. It was about showing up every day in quiet ways. Tommy had finally seen that. He had always thought of his father's service as something external, something separate from their everyday lives. But now, he understood that the respect his father had earned wasn't something that needed to be claimed. It was something that had already been given, just by living with integrity and honor. As the woman disappeared out the door, and Tommy settled back into the booth beside his father, he realized that his journey, in a sense, had just begun. What he had wanted to stand up for his father was not the same as what he needed. What he needed was to understand that respect was a quiet, internal thing. It was not about confrontation or making the world see things his way. It was about finding the strength to live with dignity, to accept that not everything could be changed with words. Some things were just meant to be understood in silence. And that, Tommy realized, was the real victory. Tommy sat back in his seat, his mind racing as the woman walked out of Liberty Café, leaving him with a strange mix of relief and guilt. He had done what he thought was right. He had stood up for his father, forced someone to confront their disrespect, and in doing so, had defended the honor of the man who had sacrificed so much. But now, as the silence hung in the air, Tommy couldn't shake the sense that something was missing, something that had once seemed so clear, but now seemed impossibly distant. The world outside the cafe window appeared unchanged. The cars passed by, The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the usual hum of city life continued. Inside, the chatter resumed as patrons went back to their meals, oblivious to the scene that had just unfolded. Ben, Tommy's father, sipped his coffee with a contented sigh, lost in thought. His gaze was calm, absent of any tension or anxiety, as if the small exchange had never happened. Tommy envied him for that, his father's ability to move through life with such quiet ease, with such a firm grasp on his own sense of self. But Tommy wasn't at ease. Not anymore. As the woman had walked away, leaving her apology hanging in the air, Tommy felt a sense of disillusionment seep into his chest. The apology was too little too late. It had come not from a place of genuine understanding, but from a place of discomfort. The woman hadn't changed, not really. She had been caught off guard by his words, embarrassed by her own behavior, but there was no true sense of remorse in her voice. She had apologized not because she had learned something, but because she had been forced into it. And that realization left a sour taste in Tommy's mouth. The satisfaction he had expected from standing up for his father had faded quickly, replaced by a quiet sense of emptiness. Was this really what he had been fighting for? Was this the validation he had sought? The apology? The confrontation? In the heat of the moment, it had seemed so important. He had wanted to prove to the woman that his father was more than just an old man with a military cap. He had wanted to make her see his father's sacrifices, his service, and the quiet strength that came with living a life dedicated to something greater than oneself. But now, as he sat there, the enormity of what had just happened began to settle over him. The confrontation had been an outburst, not a victory. It hadn't been a triumph of justice. It had been a momentary release of his own frustration and confusion. Tommy shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling the weight of the entire day pressing down on him. The woman's words were still echoing in his head, but now, it wasn't the insult that bothered him, it was the realization that he had been using her in a way. He had been looking for a battle, looking for someone to fight so he could feel justified in his actions, so he could prove to himself and the world that he was doing the right thing. But now, sitting in the quiet aftermath of that exchange, Tommy wondered if he had been fighting the wrong fight all along. What did it mean to truly honor his father's service? Was it enough to confront someone who disrespected him? Was it enough to demand an apology from a stranger, to call out her ignorance? Or was there more to it than that? Tommy's gaze shifted to his father, who was still sitting across from him, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the cafe. Ben was a man of few words, a man who had lived his life without fanfare, without seeking the approval of others. Tommy had always admired that about his father, but now, in the silence of the cafe, he began to wonder if he had misinterpreted it. Was it possible that his father didn't need anyone else to recognize his sacrifices because he had already made peace with them himself? Was it possible that Tommy had been seeking validation from the wrong sources, trying to fill an empty space inside of him that couldn't be filled by others? The truth was, Tommy had been so focused on defending his father, on making others understand his father's worth, that he had never stopped to consider whether his father needed that defense at all. Ben didn't need anyone to praise him, to validate his choices, or to give him the recognition he deserved. He had already made peace with his own service, his own history, and his own place in the world. It wasn't about other people's opinions. It was about living with integrity and knowing that the work he had done mattered, even if the world never acknowledged it. And yet, here Tommy was, trying to force others to see his father the way he saw him, trying to make the world understand the depth of his father's sacrifice, even though his father didn't care whether anyone else saw it. Tommy's entire approach had been wrong. He had been seeking approval from the wrong place, from the woman at the table, from the people in the cafe, from the world at large, when the truth was, his father had already given him the greatest lesson of all, that validation comes from within. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Tommy looked down at his hands, which had unconsciously clenched into fists. The frustration inside of him had nowhere to go now. The confrontation was over. The woman had left, the apology given, and yet Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. That somehow, despite his bravado, he had failed in the very thing he had set out to do: honor his father's service. He looked back at his father, who who was still quietly sipping his coffee. The older man's calm demeanor seemed to amplify Tommy's growing sense of inadequacy. He had expected some kind of grand revelation, some moment of clarity, after standing up for his father. But all he felt now was a sense of loss. He had fought someone else's battle, thinking it would bring him closer to his father, thinking it would give him the validation he was craving. But now, in the wake of it all, Tommy realized the truth. There was no validation to be found in confrontation, no satisfaction to be gained from forcing others to acknowledge your worth. In that moment, Tommy saw how far he had been from understanding his father's quiet strength. Ben had never needed validation from anyone, not even his own son. He had never sought recognition for his service, never expected anyone to throw a parade in his honor. He had done what he had done because it was what needed to be done, and that was enough. Tommy had spent so much of his life looking for external approval, trying to make others see the things he valued in his father, that he had never stopped to consider that it was never about what other people saw. It was about living with integrity, with quiet dignity, and with a sense of self that didn't rely on others' perceptions. The heavy price Tommy was paying wasn't one of physical harm or public embarrassment. It was the realization that he had been living for the wrong reasons. He had been fighting for approval, for acknowledgement, from people who would never understand his father's sacrifices, and in doing so, he had missed the point entirely. The real lesson was one he hadn't learned yet, that respect, honor, and dignity aren't things you demand from others. They are things you live by, every single day, regardless of who is watching. Tommy's hands relaxed, his fingers uncurling slowly. His chest felt tight, but it was a different kind of tightness now, not from anger or frustration, but from a deep, gnawing understanding. He had wanted to make a difference, to show the world that his father mattered. But the truth was, his father had already done that, quietly, without fanfare or recognition. The real lesson had been about humility, the humility to accept that sometimes the people we most admire don't need us to fight their battles for them. They've already fought them on their own terms. Ben put his cup down with a soft clink, finally meeting Tommy's eyes. For a brief moment, they just stared at each other. There were no words between them, but in that silence, Tommy understood. The real victory wasn't in the confrontation. It wasn't in forcing someone to apologize or making them see his father's worth. The victory was in the quiet acceptance of what had been accomplished, not just by his father, but by Tommy himself, in learning that true strength comes from within, not from the validation of others. Tommy smiled faintly, a small, bittersweet smile, and nodded. "You're right, Dad," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't need to say more than that. The moment had passed, and in the end, Tommy understood that sometimes the heaviest price we pay is for the realization that we were looking for answers in all the wrong places. The cafe had quieted to a hum of muted conversations, the clinking of spoons and cups, the soft shuffle of chairs scraping against the floor. People were going about their day as though nothing had changed, as though nothing significant had just happened. But Tommy knew better. Something profound had shifted within him during that short, charged moment, a revelation that had come not from a triumphant exchange or a victory over an enemy, but from the quiet, lingering weight of truth. Tommy sat in the booth, his coffee long cold, his hands resting on the table as he stared at his father across from him. Ben Williams, the quiet man who had taught him everything he knew about duty, honor, and resilience, sat there calmly, completely unaware of the internal battle that had just raged within Tommy. He had not seen the confrontation. He had not heard Tommy's impassioned words to the woman who had dared insult him. For all his father knew, it had been a regular day at the cafe, an ordinary moment in an ordinary life. But for Tommy, the world had shifted. He had learned something about himself, his father, and the nature of true strength that would change the way he viewed his family, his relationships, and his place in the world. The encounter had felt like a confrontation at first, a battle between a stranger's disrespect and Tommy's desperate need to defend his father's honor. It had felt like a fight worth winning, a moment where Tommy could finally prove to the world the value of his father's sacrifice. But now, as the dust settled, Tommy realized that the battle had never truly been about the woman at the table or her misguided comment. It had been about something deeper, a lesson that had been taught to him without words, without fanfare, in a way that he had never fully understood before. He had been seeking something that could not be found in confrontation or external validation. What he had been looking for was a reflection of his father's quiet, unshakable integrity, something that existed not in the eyes of others, but in the way one lived, every single day. Tommy's father had never needed applause. He had never craved recognition for his years of service. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. And now Tommy understood that. Now, he could see the truth of what his father had been trying to teach him all these years, even if he hadn't fully grasped it until this very moment. As the cafe continued to hum around him, Tommy felt a wave of quiet understanding wash over him. He had been fighting the wrong battle. His father had never needed him to fight for him. He had needed Tommy to see the value in living with honor, in living with strength that was measured not by the world's applause, but by the peace one felt within themselves. That was the true legacy of his father, one that could not be won in an argument or an apology, but one that could only be lived. Tommy's eyes flicked over to his father again. Ben had set his cup down and was staring out the window, his gaze distant, as though lost in thought. Tommy watched him for a moment, noticing the subtle lines of age that creased his father's face, the quiet strength in his posture, the steadiness of his presence. Ben Williams was a man of few words, a man who had lived through unimaginable hardship and sacrifice, yet had never once sought to draw attention to it. He had never demanded recognition. And Tommy realized now, as he looked at him, that it was that quiet strength, born from humility, from a life lived with purpose, that had been his father's greatest lesson. Tommy's hand tightened around his mug of coffee, though he didn't drink from it. The warmth of the cup seeped into his fingers, a small comfort amidst the torrent of thoughts that had taken over his mind. He was no longer angry. He was no longer resentful of the woman who had mocked his father's service. There was no satisfaction in her apology. There was no sense of justice in the way the confrontation had played out. All he felt now was a kind of quiet understanding, a realization that the battle he had fought was not one that could ever be won with words. It had been won long before, in the way his father had lived, in the quiet dignity of his service, in the way he had always carried himself with integrity. Tommy closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to breathe deeply, letting the realization settle within him. It wasn't the victory he had thought he wanted. It wasn't the grand moment of triumph he had imagined when he first confronted the woman. But it was something more profound, something far more meaningful than any external recognition or apology. What he had gained that day wasn't an apology from a stranger. It was a new understanding of what true strength and honor really meant. And that was a gift far more valuable than anything else. The bell above the door jingled, signaling the entrance of new customers into the cafe, but Tommy didn't look up. He didn't need to. The noise of the world outside, the endless shuffle of people coming and going, faded into the background as he focused on the man across from him, the man who had given him everything, even if he hadn't known it at the time. His father's life wasn't defined by accolades or applause. It was defined by the choices he made, by the way he lived each day with purpose and dignity. For the first time in his life, Tommy felt a sense of peace. He understood now that his father's quiet resilience was a strength far more powerful than any confrontation. He had been so eager to defend his father's honor, to prove to the world that his sacrifices mattered. But the truth was, his father didn't need the world to see his worth. His worth had already been proven, not in medals or awards, but in every quiet choice he made, in every sacrifice he endured, in every day he lived with honor and integrity. Tommy sat back in his seat, looking around the cafe. Nothing had really changed. People were still chatting, laughing, going about their day. But everything had changed for Tommy. He had learned a new truth, one that couldn't be conveyed in words or fights. It was a truth he would carry with him from that day forward. That true strength wasn't about confrontation or winning battles. It wasn't about making others see your worth. It was about living in a way that made your worth undeniable. A voice interrupted his thoughts. His father's voice. "Are you okay, Tommy?" Ben asked, his tone gentle but observant. Tommy turned to face him. For a moment, he didn't speak. The words caught in his throat. What could he say? Could he explain what had just happened inside him? Could he make his father understand the lesson he had just learned? Probably not. Ben didn't need to know. He had already lived it. And Tommy had finally begun to understand what it meant. "I'm good, Dad," Tommy said, his voice thick but steady. He smiled, a real smile, one that came from a place of understanding and acceptance. He didn't need to say more. His father didn't need an explanation. Ben knew his son well enough to see the change in him, even without words. It was there in Tommy's quiet confidence, in the way he sat a little straighter, the way his eyes were a little softer. Ben gave him a small nod, as if accepting the unspoken truth between them. He didn't press further. Instead, he reached for his coffee, taking another slow sip, and then said, almost casually, "Well, I think we should head home soon. There's always work to be done." Tommy nodded. The weight of the day's events hung on him, but now it felt manageable. The burden of trying to prove something had lifted. He didn't need to fight for his father's honor. It was already there, already woven into the fabric of every quiet, steadfast moment his father had lived. They sat together for a few more minutes, each lost in their own thoughts, the hum of the cafe surrounding them. Outside, the world continued on its way. And Tommy, finally at peace, realized that he was ready to return to that world, armed with a new understanding. The real battle wasn't one fought in public, with words or confrontation. The real battle was the one fought within oneself, a battle for inner peace, for the quiet strength to live a life of integrity, no matter who was watching. As they stood to leave, Tommy felt the weight of his father's legacy settle into him, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He no longer needed to fight for validation. He had learned that true strength lay in quiet dignity, in the ability to live with purpose, to live without needing others' approval. As they walked out of the cafe, Tommy felt something shift within him, something profound and lasting. He didn't know where this new understanding would take him, but he knew one thing. He was no longer the same person who had walked in. He was different now, armed with the truth he had been seeking all along. And that truth, he realized, would guide him forward, into whatever came next.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.